Morning, everyone. So I guess it was risk mitigation in action yesterday. You know, there was that possibility of a presenter not coming through, and we kind of mitigated it through me. So I really hope I don't disappoint. I am very excited to present to everyone today. And the topic we'll be discussing is the 10 common risk management failures and how to avoid them. So the reason why I looked into this is if we look at the past in terms of the previous global financial crisis when risk management actually took birth, and as South Africa, we're also re-entering into a recession. There's also been recent headline front page news made with various corporate scandals. Every time I look on News 24, I see something about Steinhoff, or there's something else about KPMG or McKinsey. And at the end of the day, it's always very fashionable to talk about the role that risk management has played or still continues to play in these types of scandals. If we step back and examine and look at what's really transpired, there's usually certain questions that are always being asked or being expressed by people when it comes to these types of scandals. Firstly, what were they thinking? What did they know? And how did they let this happen? And the common thread that I found throughout all these case studies, for lack of a better word, is that unfortunately risk management has failed. But in trying to understand these failures, we can put measures in place to ensure that we try, or to ensure that they can be avoided moving forward. So, as I mentioned before, I'm going to talk you through 10 common risk management failures and how to avoid them. The first one, and the most imperative, I feel, is poor governance and the tone at the top. So effective governance and the tone at the top drive transparency, openness, and commitment to continuous improvement needed for risk management to function effectively. At the end of the day, leadership's failure will almost always determine or undermine the strongest risk management capabilities. So what do I mean by that? When management fails to understand the nature of the types of risks that are being undertaken by the organization, or if risks are not considered explicitly by management when evaluating new market ventures, products, or an acquisition or investment, and where there is an ineffective or non-existent communication of risk management, both up, down, and across the organization. So too often, the focus that we find by management or by the executive is on the short term, what's going to happen the next month or the next quarter. And we need to strike a balance between value creation and protection, as well as present and future. But this requires leadership and discipline. The second failure is looking at reckless risk-taking. So there's a time-honored fundamental lesson. We learned this in MBA, and we've learned this through the previous case studies of corporate scandals that have taken place. And a whole lot of different industries have learned or relearning this particular lesson, in that, yes, the reliance on competent people is an important aspect of risk management. But when we solely rely on them without questioning the decisions that they make, without taking into consideration or looking into the various checks and balances that come with those decisions, aligning them to the business plans and the strategy of that business, as well as without having independent monitoring and reporting, this can eventually lead to the downside or the failure of an organization, it is very ill-advised to do so. Okay. So what should we do in these instances? Okay. So it's very often to find the smartest person in the room or your star performer and just agree to everything he or she has been said or what they're proposing on the table. But in fact, we should push back a little bit. Start asking them the questions, okay? Why have you made this particular decision? Is it for the best interests of the company or the organization? Who has been monitoring this? Has internal audit, for example, looked into this? Is it aligned with our company strategy? You know, what are the potential risks that could emanate from this particular decision that you've taken? Don't be scared to push back a little bit just because they are the star performers. Secondly, we also need to pay attention to how your particular organization or a organization incentivize decisions, okay? Is it a culture, is it a warrior culture that's being cultivated, whereby certain targets have to be met, irrespective of the type of decisions that we make, as long as we make those targets, okay? So is it an incentive for risk taking, or do we incentivize good behavior, good risk decisions? And lastly, transparency. Now, transparency is very important, and it should be emphasized in order to facilitate certain discussions, such as risk-taking, which impact the business planning. And what I mean by this is that, you know, if you lead with a culture of fear or a warrior-type culture, we're not open to communication, and we don't ask the necessary questions, which could lead to reputational damage. Okay. The third failure is the inability to implement enterprise risk management. Now, this failure is one that we see time and time again. Most efforts to implement ERM are unfocused, severely resource constrained, and pushed down so far into the organization that it's difficult to even establish their relevance. Okay? So the long-term result for risk management is that it's never elevated to a strategic level and driven by functional silos within the organization. Okay? So board and management should actually empower a group of senior executives to define the role of risk management. But over and above that, this needs to be supplemented by two fundamental questions. Okay? Firstly, what are our priority risks within the organization, and how shall we manage these risks? In asking these two fundamental questions, it sets the foundation for a business case, and it justifies risk management being elevated to a strategic level within the enterprise. The fourth failure is that of non-existent, ineffective, or inefficient risk assessment. So this failure arises when risk assessment activities are not identifying key risks effectively, efficiently, and promptly. So we often see the relevancy issue when management itself experiences difficulty in translating these issues identified by a risk assessment into actionable steps within the business plan itself. So it's very important to link your risk assessment to your business plan. Okay. The fifth failure is called falling prey to herd mentality. So what do I mean by this? It's when management continues to execute the same strategy and business model despite the change in market conditions or their operating environment. Okay. So if the organization is too insular in its outlook, it's important that the risk management function consider multiple views of the operating environment over the planning horizon, so over your 2 and 5 year strategy planning horizon, to assess how the strategy would perform, and also ensure that strategy setting processes allow for periodically evaluating how well the strategy is performing. The sixth failure deals with understanding that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it mindset. Now, a prevalent view is that if you can't manage risk, if you can't measure risk, you can't manage it. Now, the inability to measure risk will not make it go away, unfortunately. Okay? And managing solely to measurable is never enough. And it ignores important issues that should be on the radar for decision making. So what I mean by this is that if you come across a risk that cannot be quantified in terms of your usual quantification measures, it's important to open up the line of communication, okay, with the person who owns the risk, who would possibly be in charge of putting control measures in place, and try and understand what is this risk. If we open up levels of communication, it brings about the importance of not only quantifying the risk, but looking at it from a qualitative point of view. And moving forward, we'll see, especially with all, if we look back at the global financial crisis, that qualifying risks rather than quantifying that was just as important. And that's a different step forward in how we look at risk management. Okay. Failure number 7 deals with accepting a lack of transparency in high-risk areas. Okay. So the lack of information for decision-making leaves management with little insight as to what really is happening or is likely to happen. Dysfunctional, excessive risk-taking is fostered by the inability to see the full picture. So it's vital for executive management to create risk awareness and an open, positive culture with respect to risk and managing risk across an enterprise, so that they and the members of the board understand all aspects of how the business model works. Okay? Such an environment can only flourish when individuals can raise issues without fear of retribution to either compensation or their careers. So we're taking a step back and we're talking once again about risk culture and creating an element of fear around discussing possible high risks and people not actually being transparent about the risks or the potential risks that could be experienced because they feel that the light is going to be completely shone on them and they feel that they'll be reprimanded for certain mistakes that they've done. But we shouldn't look at it that way. In fact, we should look at it as lessons learned and how can we improve. And this all has to deal with culture in itself, which I'll speak to more at a later stage. The 8th failure is not integrating risk management with strategy. Okay. Unfortunately, risk is often the afterthought when it comes to the formulation of strategy, okay, which results in strategic objectives that may be unrealistic and risk management becoming an appendage to performance management. So the consequence of this failure is that the strategy within the organization, one is not able to deliver that. There could be deteriorating competitive positions, the inability to adapt to a changing operating environment, and unfortunately, the possibility of a loss of enterprise value that took years to build. Okay. So In this instance, it's very important to implement an integrated approach and discipline to deploy strategy, manage the associated risks, as well as performance management. Okay. Number 9, we talk a little bit more about culture. So ignoring the dysfunctionalities and blind spots of the organization's culture. An organization's culture, and for those of you who attended the last session that I did when we spoke about risk culture, we spoke about how huge of an impact it can have on the ability to prevent the occurrence of unacceptable risk events and identify new and emerging risks in a changing operating environment. Openness, transparency, and accountability are all topics companies should be considering in the current environment and improving on continuously in future. Unfortunately, cultural issues, even though they are significant, they can be quite a challenge to change. It's a huge change management project. It will take time, but it's not impossible. One needs to continuously insist on an open dialogue regarding both risks and opportunities. Okay. And lastly, the failure of not involving the board timeously. And this I've seen time and time again. In my personal experience, also sitting at board and executive level. Unfortunately, risk management, when it's not given a seat at the table, it's very easy to pass it by, when it comes to board decisions. Either management will make a decision and tell the board after the fact that something's happened, or they'll withhold certain information, or you'll have the risk report there and it'll be a complete 2-minute overview of what the potential risks are, and everybody would disagree without asking any questions. And I think therein lies the problem. And without having either a sponsor who's going to speak on your behalf at board level, without having a CRO who's actually going to sit at the board meetings and give a voice to risk. Unfortunately, this is the failure that we're going to experience time and time again. But it can be changed by looking at good risk reports that are not just, that are more value add and reflect the potential decisions in terms of where the business is heading and how they can affect the strategy and what the potential mitigation plans are in terms of that. So if we provide them with good reports, the board can openly and quickly decipher what are the top risks within the organization and how we can better them. So, I've spoken a lot about why risk management has failed, but these are a few quotes talking about why it's important to have risk management. And I feel that the third one, seeing that Chris couldn't be here today, is my way of giving him his due. And it's also very important what he said. So he says, quote unquote, "If risk management is properly embedded within an organization and strong risk management culture adopted, we will see more organizations being able to maintain stability during times of difficulty and seize the opportunities that come their way to prosper." Okay. So what can we do? In a nutshell, it all stems, two things. Risk management needs to be more of a value add, not a tick box exercise. And how do we shift that compliance type role, tick box exercise, to a value add project? Within the risk management function, we ourselves need to be more open to the business, okay? Not go there with our typical risk registers on a monthly or quarterly basis, where everyone like dreads, sitting around the table and discussing their risks, because they're going to give us the same old time and time again. So we need to be more integrated within the company. We need to build good relationships with various people within the organization. We also need to have buy-in. So we need good relationships with the executive and the board, so that buy-in comes from the top and we get the correct tone from the top, which is filtered down throughout the organization. Okay? So we get a top-down, bottom-up approach as well. The other very important thing I feel is that we need to identify the right risks at all levels within the organization and deliver meaningful business decision reporting. Now, this takes time. As they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. But it is possible, and it starts at EXO and it starts at board level. And even if we have the slightest change in terms of mindset from the CEO or even from your chairman of your risk and audit committees, that's a start in the right direction. But we need to remember that, as risk managers, we're facilitating the process, and being influencers and building relationships, that is the most important. And if we sit back and just let things sort of slide and do our day-to-day functions by just attending the usual workshops and training and letting them fill in the registers, we ourselves are also to blame for the failures that occur within our corporates ourselves. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents worth.
I think we're all in the same boat here with risk management often being seen as a compliance type tick box exercise, not really valued in many organizations, or like the poor cousin. So I think these are 10 really good points that come through, and I think we're all in the same kind of situation from a risk side. I was chatting to one of the chief audit executive the other day, and he also said that the very difficult thing is he's meant to report into audit committee, which reports to the board, but the guys that pay his salary are the exco and the CEO, and if he comes up and starts rocking the boat in the organization, that it's possibly a career limiting move. So there are, and I think in public sector it's even worse. So there are some real challenges in terms of being the voice out there, the voice of reason. Not all about negativity. We all talk about opportunity, but the idea, even in a small organization like ours, we all have different ideas and this and that, and you often think you've got all the answers, and when you suddenly hear everyone else's input, you realize that maybe your initial ideas and your initial strategy or objectives is not quite as simple as that, and that we need to consider what could go wrong, as well as take chances that are calculated as well. So I don't know, are there any questions in the audience, or do you guys find that this resonates with you, the points that Mira's brought up today? Are there any questions?
Morning, everyone. My name is Mzikaisa Dondolo. My question is on the risk management at board level. Fortunately, I sit at Exco as well as at board. But when it gets at board level, the chief risk officer doesn't present the report, but it gets presented by the chairperson of the audit committee, which the report always have only one paragraph in terms of risk management. So my feeling is the message doesn't get across to the board level, and the board doesn't discuss the serious issues pertaining to the exposure of the organization. How can one deal with that?
So I think in this instance, education and training is of utmost importance. There's a saying that knowledge is powerful. And I feel that if the board understands the importance of risk management and the role that it plays within an organization and the value add that it can create. That would change a mindset incrementally. And at the end of the day, even the company secretary, as an officer, has the duty to look at the risk governance and maybe put up his or her hand to say, let's have a discussion about this. What are the significant risks, including the CRO? And I understand that it can be difficult in terms of who they're reporting to, but it's a fiduciary duty at the end of the day. So if the discussion is not being held, I think it just takes bravery, a little bit of risk, to say, can we perhaps just talk about this a little bit more? Because in terms of this report, we have highlighted X, Y, Z. But prior to that, maybe also have a discussion with the board, have a discussion with Exco, and explain to them, why is risk management important? Why are we doing this? We're not trying to tick the box for King 4. We're trying to make a difference. We're trying to help you achieve your goals moving forward in terms of your 2 and 4 year horizons. And at the end of the day, we're trying to save you money, So we're not trying to look and say, what have you done wrong? But rather, this could potentially happen, but how can we help you do better? And I think if they understand that, they'll look at risk management differently.
Thank you. My name is Nosipo. I just want to check on the terminology, though, of risk, because the way we define risk, is it not a future event, such that, because I come from the audit space, you find that we're reporting on events that have happened, and we're still using the term risk. And I think that is why maybe some of the things are not being taken seriously, because we're constantly talking future event, which most cases have happened. And yeah, I don't know, I find that it is constantly a cycle that is not moving because of the word risk. Shouldn't we, when we know things have happened, then we call it issue management, such that even risk, when they bring whatever strategies or whatever they are trying to get business to do, should they not be talking to issue management? Or because risk is always the future, and yet the future has hit every day. Thank you.
So I agree with you 100%. I think there's a clear distinction between issues and a risk, and this was always my argument. Although you can still experience risk in certain issues, but there is a clear line that can be drawn between the two. And a risk, without a doubt, is an unforeseen potential of a future event, okay? But the important part of that definition is based on your strategic objectives. And that's why it's imperative that when we set the strategy, or when the organization sets the strategy, that a representative from the risk function or risk department or risk business unit is available and is there to say, yeah, okay, so you guys, I remember reading an article by Nike, and their strategy was to crush Adidas, okay? And that's great, that was their slogan, that's what they wanted to do, that's what they wanted to achieve. What would be the potential risks in that? It could create a culture, a very competitive culture. It could create a warrior culture like we spoke about earlier, where people take the wrong decisions just so that they could move forward, so they could crush the other brand. Is that something that you want to do? What is your appetite as an organization? And I think these are the discussions that we should be having. So it's, for me, I feel, as us as risk practitioners, it's very easy to understand or distinguish the difference between a risk risk and an issue. But the normal person, whether they be at board level or they be at middle or lower management, they don't understand this as well as we do. But if we articulate it to them in very simple language, so that they understand why we're here, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, I think it can be achieved. And just a constant reminder to say, okay, guys, these are issues, they're not really risks. What do you want to achieve? Or what are your goals for the next quarter or for the next year? Okay, fine, these are your goals, A, B, C. So what could prevent you from achieving this? You know, just maybe say it in a different way, something that can appeal to both their hearts and minds.
I've got 2 comments that could be questions, but the one is around complacency. And I don't know if that should be number 11 or it is just a thread throughout risk management, that many times an organization fails because it becomes complacent. And I've seen that in 2 areas. The one is they are doing things well, and they've got the ticks in the box. They've got all the things you're mentioning. And I don't know if you start to feel complacent and you think it's not going to happen, and what you can do for that to try and keep people on their toes, whether it's a lot of refreshing, training, or, well, you know, sometimes board members don't like to think that they need training, but constantly coming up with the latest articles, what's happening, what preventative measures other organizations are taking. I think just to keep it fresh is one area. And then the other thing around complacency is because nothing has happened. I'm looking at fires now in the city. Even though everything was done, they've had big reports, everything states that these buildings should be condemned, people moved out. It didn't happen because it hasn't happened for years, nothing's happened. And again, that's sort of the ultimate, that something bad does happen. But we have lots of examples now in the public and private sector of where people just got complacent because nothing really big happened and then something massive happened. And then the other point is a good one. I think we're moving away from professional board members, people who they make their life of just being on boards. People are scared. And they see it's a huge responsibility nowadays, the big insurance products now to mitigate that risk. But and it doesn't actually, because if you actually do something personally wrong, nothing covers you. You are liable. And I just think we're getting a lot more people who are professional, who are knowledgeable, and companies should look for those people to be in their boards, not the yes guys who are just coming and getting a stipend. But you should actively go out and look for the guys who are going to be troublemakers and are going to question, but from a base of knowledge and from a base of trying to ensure that the enterprise is going to succeed and do well. So don't be scared of recruiting board members who are, you know, the guys from hell. Okay.
I agree 100% with you. I think complacency is an issue, and it's sort of I think it was failure number 4 or 5 in terms of the herd mentality. You know, when everything's going brilliantly, we tend to follow the same strategy through, despite changes in market conditions and the environment that we're operating in. And I feel it's very important for us as risk professionals to always challenge the status quo, because the one thing that remains constant is change. There's things happening all over continuously, and it is challenging for us. I think we experience a lot of frustration as risk professionals on a day-to-day basis, not only from the organization but from senior management and the board as well. So, you know, at times we can also feel, oh, well, if things are going well, maybe I can just breathe for a second. But unfortunately, our profession is such that things are constantly changing, and we always need to be at the front end of what's going on, and try and educate everyone else, because that is our responsibility and duty. So I completely understand where you're coming from, and I agree with you. Yeah.
You're talking a lot about risk failure here, but sometimes risk can be positive. High risk, high reward. Do you feel that at the moment in South African culture and the way businesses are going, that people are always looking at the negative side of risk and are not willing to take steps forward to embrace risk?
So that's totally dependent on an organization's risk appetite and tolerance level. You get certain industries that are less risk averse than others, and I primarily have worked within the financial sector, and they are risk averse, and they don't like the high risk, high return mentality. I've also worked in other organizations where this cowboy mentality was embraced, but that too can come with a lot of repercussions in terms of financial loss, reputational loss. So yeah, I think for me, the take home from today's discussion, even though I haven't looked at the opportunities, which there are many, is to say, we need to be cognizant of the failures, because unfortunately they seem to be happening time and time again with rather large institutions. It started off with Enron, moved on to other companies, and now recently it's been Steinhoff, KPMG, McKinsey. Who's next? What's next? Why? Why is this happening? And in researching and going through all of these are the trends that I found. And it's for us not to say that there aren't good opportunities, but rather to be a little bit cautious and aware. I think awareness is important, to be knowledgeable and say, okay, well, this is what's happened in the past. As a risk manager, this is my responsibility to try and ensure that the organization doesn't go through this again. And I think that's just the take home. But in terms of looking at high risk, high reward, that's completely dependent on an organization. It could work in their favor, or it could end up being another Enron.
So just to add to that, I think, in fact, Chris Palm was mentioning it the other day, is that also in every risk there's normally an opportunity as well. So when there are risks, you need to think, well, there are risks here, but what are the opportunities? And I think he was referring to something at Eskom once when they had water problems, and then they found a whole different almost business line around pumping water out and supplying water almost. I mean, I know that's not what Eskom do, but there are almost always, with every risk, a knock-on effect or around opportunities. So it's not always looking at opportunities, but also what are the opportunities that come out of risk management. And another thing, just to answer the other lady about incident management, we see that often. A lot of people record incidents as risks. Amira's right. We can, with the right kind of coaching, you can identify what real risks are. But another thing, even with incidents, if you identify contributing factors or causes, that's also a very important aspect to seeing what the underlying risk is or what the cause is and how can we control the causes. So that's a big part of risk management as well, as causes often are related to more than one risk, and if we can control some of the causes, we can actually manage the risks as well and also identify the right risks.
Hi everyone, I'm Smeya from SNGGT. I just want to make 2-3 comments as well. On the opportunity side, so if you look at King 4 no more refers to risk management as risk management alone. They call it opportunity and risk management. And I just want to mention 2-3 examples just for the crowd's sake, you know. So a good example is Discovery. If many of you don't know, Discovery was started in 1994 when there was a lot of uncertainty in the country, and the CEO then looked at it as an opportunity. So it's a good example. Another good example is now universities. So you all know what's happening in universities. They're all looking for money. Instead of sitting back, they're looking at third stream income. So, you know, they're taking it as opportunity. So don't just look at as risk as bad, but is the CEO says here, you know, look for the opportunity within the risk. It's becoming important. It's becoming important in terms of culture as well, that when we teach our people to think, we need them to think in terms of positive as well, and not only the negative. The other thing that I find very important is, I think, your fourth point about implementing ERM. You know, it's because we're sitting in an environment like this, I think it's great for me to say that a great risk system helps. You know, we're moving towards real-time reporting, and it becomes important that we move towards this year, especially in the environment that we work in, because when a risk is realized, it's often, you know, you get the board member that comes to know about it much later. And I come from previously the academic environment where some of your council members don't even know that the risk has realized. But if you have a great, strong system in place, I mean, they'll get the email immediately, the risk has realized, and we're moving into crisis management, which I think, you know, we should look at in terms of crisis management. And it comes to your point, to say if we're looking at events, then we're reactive in our risk management, and we're not proactive in our risk management. That means that, you know, we're doing something wrong. We need to start changing the way we're thinking, and it links to strategy and objectives. And the last thing, you know, one thing to keep our board on our toes. I don't know if there was a point somewhere about keeping the board on our toes. So what we find that works is scenario planning. It's a brilliant game, a brilliant tool. You know, you walk in your boardroom and you say, okay, guys, board members, this is not an ordinary board meeting. We're in crisis management. We have our staff that are downstairs rioting. What do you do? And then you see their reaction. So it's a great way to keep your board involved, you know, or even your management, or even your people. And I know they do it with BCM, and most people, when they hear that siren, they're like, oh no, you know, it's another one of those things. But it's important, you know, what do you do? How do you react? So those are just some of the points that I'd like to make from my side.
I would have loved to hear more on the practical side of whatever, like a practical application of those 10 failures. I think we would. I think we have heard number 5, which is now married to this complacency that she was talking about. But I would have loved to hear more practical application of those in terms of because in your opening remarks you alluded to a number of failures, that corporate failures. So I was wondering if in your research, or is it confidential that you cannot use one of them as a case study, to just apply one or two of those reasons for failures to any of the failures that we have seen in the past. I mean, like Stanio, for example. Now, yesterday I was listening to the former CEO. I got a bit of his testimony here and there, and I think he appears basically to be refusing to say that there was nothing wrong, or there was nothing that was not done by the company. The only thing was some alarmist approach by the auditors who refused to sign the accounts, and therefore everyone else started wondering why, and therefore people lost and everything else followed from the refusal to sign the account. So they don't see anything that either failed in the risk management or any of their processes that they are supposed to do. I would have loved really to say, I mean, sessions like this to come up with some research and tie it up to some case studies and apply, you know, from what we have either researched or come up with, unless it is something that cannot be discussed cannot be used as for confidentiality purposes.
Yes, without doubt, case studies would have been good. Unfortunately, you know, we do have a very limited time space in which this discussion has to be delivered. we wouldn't have had the time to go into such a session. It would have been literally a half-day workshop if I was to do that with you, to go through all the practical steps of what went wrong and how to resolve it, and give you good examples of that. You know, with the more recent cases, it's also very difficult to speak about in an open forum, but we can use old cases that have been in the public domain for a period of time. And if that's something that everybody is interested in, or you know, you want to talk about it further, please feel free to contact me, and yeah, we can have that discussion maybe over a cup of coffee.
I know we've written some articles that refer to case studies some time back, so what I can do is send you some links to those. But I do agree with you. Practical examples of things that have gone wrong, and then where was risk management at the time. So, I mean, there are lots of examples of corporate failures. A lot of them from overseas, but there are write-ups on some of these case studies, and I think that's a very good point. That's what makes it practical. You know, everyone always thinks, oh, these kind of things always happen to someone else. They don't happen to my company. But I mean, when you look at, you know, what's happening to MTN now and things like that, and the risks that they would have taken going to Nigeria, and how, you know, and various things like that. I mean, it's absolutely frightening. You know, I mean, that even those kind of things that are happening to MTN affect all of us, because that's potential money that ends up flowing out of South Africa. So there, you know, downgrades, and there's so many examples. But you are right. It is nice to have, and we'll try for the future as well to get maybe one or two people. I know we've often have futures research talk about some of these practical examples have gone wrong. Nikki Weimer, often from Nedbank, has spoken to us on the economy before. So we'll look, and Mira as well. We can engage further in terms of practical examples.
My question is quite simple. You've listed quite a number of good points, but the key one that came to mind is risk management designed for the risk taker? If you look at those people that makes a company fail, it's because they're risk takers. The other 90% of the company is us, and we comply to those rules.
That is a brilliant comment. I don't really know how to answer back on that one. I think I alluded to that in I think it was point number 2 in terms of risk takers and competent star performers that you have within an organization. And because they bring in so much money, or they do so well, they tend to sometimes, you know, we're all human at the end of the day, and sometimes our ego gets the better of us, and we start thinking we've got these superhuman powers and we can make decisions at a whim, and because everything's been going so well in the past, there shouldn't really be anything to worry about moving forward. And I think it's those people that are important to identify within the organization, and try and keep them on their toes as far as possible if we can. You know, ask them the difficult questions. Yeah, it's cool, you're a star performer, you do really great, you bring in a lot of money for the organization, but why have you decided to go down this route? You know, does it align with our appetite and tolerance level? Does it align with our culture? Does it align with our strategy in terms of our 2 and 4 year horizons? Why have you decided to take this route? And I think, you know, usually these types of individuals don't get asked these questions. But as soon as someone maybe asks them, or there's independent monitoring of these types of behaviors, and when the light is shone on them, you know, there could be a little bit of a shift in thinking, and that's all you really need, is a bit of a shift to change that mindset. So it starts by asking the question.
Thank you. I think one of the failures that stood out for me was, I think, number 6, inability to measure risk. Often at audit committee level, and as well as board level, we normally, after the assessment, we have a risk register. You've got your color, it's colorful, it's green, amber, and, you know, red. And then we think we've done ERM. We don't actually quantify the risks. And also, I think for other risks, we normally have mitigation action plans going forward, and we don't measure the effectiveness of those, so that we can continuously also reevaluate the residual risks. And then I think coupled with that is the the ability to identify emerging risks, because let's say that at board level you have top 6 risks that and then you have 2 emerging risks, and then you're being effective in mitigating the other risks so that they can be downgraded, and then you bring new risk on board, and this is a continuous. Oh, sorry, my phone is calling. And then I think then you can continuously actually be, like you're saying, keeping your risk register fresh, or green. So I think the other failure really, related with this inability to measure risk. Some audit and risk committees, they just want to see all risks being rated green. And whereas we could have risks that remain red, depending on your metrics, because there's nothing you can do about it, but you need to keep them under radar. So I think it's quite important to continuously be measuring and keeping your key risk indicators evaluated on a continuous basis, and being obviously, as we've said, also identifying emerging risks and making sure that you add to the risk register and monitor them continuously.
To add to that, I think what's also very important is that when we come up with control measures or action plans or treatment plans for these risks that have been identified, it's also important to provide a timeline as to when these action plans are going to come into fruition, and because ultimately then they become new controls. And if they're continuously being postponed, or if they don't come into fruition when they say they're going to, it's also very important to highlight this to the board, because that in itself is creating a risk. And control effectiveness as well is just as important. So yeah, I think it's very important to continuously look at these registers and try to make them as simple but understandable as possible to the average Joe, so that people can identify with what's going on in the business and what could possibly hamper their objectives.
Just one comment on Zenobia's comments about an organization that is a risk-taking organization. I think it's very important that risk management doesn't stifle risk-taking, and I hear what Mira says, that we should question and have checks and balances against or with people that are risk-takers. But there's also a case with risk management where I think a lot of us in organizations are very apathetic. So we see things that are going wrong in organizations, we know things aren't right, and we just become apathetic and don't say anything. So that's almost, apathy and not caring, or, well, you do care, but moaning and complaining and not being part of the solution. I always say to people, it's easy to shoot something down and find holes in things, but you must come up with something constructive in its place, or be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's what risk management can be, part of the solution, and not be apathetic. So yeah, you've got risk takers, it's great, they shouldn't be stifled, but the rest of us, the other 80-90% of us in organizations, must also not be apathetic and not care. And when we see things that aren't right, we've got to be brave and raise it. And I know often it's hell of a difficult, possibly in big organizations and in public sector, with career limiting moves and stepping on toes. But hell, I don't know, we can't just keep sitting there and letting the wrong things happen, and the poor man in the street suffers and gets no service delivery. I mean, it's just not right. We have to do what's right.
I'm from internal audit side, so risk registers are quite key for me to do an audit plan. What I've noted in several different organizations, which I'm coming to the question that whose role is it to educate the business in terms of control? Because most of the risk registers that I see, they not confused. Sometimes it's risk mitigating plan And I fail to get the controls on the risk registers, and the business get confused when I'm coming as an auditor and say, but this is not a control, it's a mitigating. But then they said, risk officers, they said, no, it's fine. So I just wanted to know whose role is it in terms of educating the business, in terms of the difference between risk mitigating plan and control, or are they the same?
So I don't believe that they're the same. I think they're two very different aspects. I think it predominantly lies within the risk division or the risk function. It's their responsibility, because if you look at your risk registers, there's various sort of columns, for lack of a better word, when you're doing your risk registers. So you look at what the strategic objective is, you look at what the risk description, what your potential risk is. And Jonathan's going to disagree with me on this one, but I'm not a believer of inherent risk. Okay, if you look at specifically ISO 31000, they don't even have a definition of inherent risk. Okay, so, and there's no real company that doesn't already have risks that are prevalent in that, unless you're a completely new greenfield startup. But even then, so I'm always looking at residual risk and then your desired risk level, instead of inherent risk and then residual risk. And that's where the difference of controls and your mitigating or action plans come in, because you already have a risk that's in place. Or you have identified a risk, but there are already controls in place, and that's what the individual or the particular business unit has to list down. And if we look at the controls that are already in place, coupled with that risk, are your controls effective or are they ineffective? And based on that, if they defined as ineffective, you would then need to go into a risk action or mitigation plan in order to further reduce your risk to a desired risk level. And I think, so it usually depends on the organization and how they approach this, but that's how you'd explain it to your individual when you're having these workshops, when you're having your risk meetings, etc., with the various divisions.
I think that's we see hundreds of different risk registers, hundreds, from different organizations, normally obviously in Excel, and normally where you're quite right. I mean, the people, they don't know the difference. There are risk registers where risks are actually incidents, where controls are mixed with mitigation plans, where contributing factors or causes are mixed with risks, where they've just got generic action plans against the risk, or where they've got 5 so-called controls, they're all just generically rated. In other words, they're either